It is July 26th, 2026, and 42 days ago, the President of the United States posted 11 words that have not aged well. Ships of the world, start your engines. Let the oil flow. That was June 14th. He was announcing that the deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran was complete. Congratulations to all. The Strait of Hormuz was reopening. The naval blockade was lifted. The war that began in February was, in his own framing, finished. 3 days later, he signed the document at the Palace of Versailles, walking out to reporters at the G7 with a single line. It's signed. Signed in Versailles. Just signed it. The Iranian president held the memorandum up for cameras and posted it to social media, calling it a historic document and a message from a strong Iran, saying peace would be achieved in the shadow of mutual respect. There were photographs. There were signatures. There was a 14-point text that the administration read aloud to the press so nobody could claim it was hidden. As of this morning, Brent crude has passed $100 a barrel for the first time since May. The naval blockade is back. American aircraft have struck targets inside Iran for 13 consecutive nights. The United States Navy has fired on merchant vessels attempting to run that blockade. Kuwait has been hit. Bahrain has been hit. Qatar has been hit. The Houthis have declared a blockade of their own against Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is now bombing Yemen in response. The president spent Friday in the Oval Office describing his exit strategy from a war he announced was over. 42 days. That is the entire lifespan of the deal. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The people who told you this was going to happen were not on the fringe. They were sitting on primetime cable television in the third week of June, in suits with 4 stars on their record, saying it out loud while the ink was still drying. They named the mechanism. They named the timeline. They were dismissed as hawks who couldn't take yes for an answer. They were right. And the reason they were right is not the reason most people think. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building since the last week of February. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes across Iran. The campaign targeted nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and government sites, and it decapitated the leadership of the Islamic Republic in a single night. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. So was Mohammad Pakpour, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who had held the position for barely 8 months after his own predecessor was killed in the June 2025 exchange. The strikes came during active negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. That detail matters, and we will come back to it, because the Iranians have never stopped citing it. Iran responded the only way it could: missiles and drones at Israel, missiles and drones at American bases across the region, missiles and drones at Gulf states hosting American forces. And then the move that turned a bilateral war into a global economic event. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Understand what that means in practical terms. The Strait of Hormuz is roughly 21 nautical miles across at its narrowest point. Somewhere around a fifth of the world's petroleum liquids move through that gap, along with an enormous share of global liquefied natural gas. There is no meaningful bypass. There are pipelines that shave off a fraction of the volume. And that is it. When Iran closes Hormuz, it is not making a statement. It is putting a hand around the throat of the global economy and squeezing to see what noise comes out. On March the 6th, the president posted that there would be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. Capital letters, no ambiguity. On March 8th, the Assembly of Experts named Mojtaba Khamenei the third supreme leader of Iran. He is the second son of the man the United States had killed 8 days earlier. He was wounded in the strike that killed his father. That same strike killed his mother, his sister, and his own wife. Hold that fact for later. It becomes the most important thing in this entire story. By April 8th, the shooting had produced enough pain on both sides that Pakistan brokered a 2-week ceasefire. The vice president flew to Islamabad, met with Pakistan's chief of army staff, and sat down with Iranian officials. Those talks failed. When they collapsed, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, and the war ground forward through the spring with a rhythm that anyone watching closely learned to recognize. Iran hits shipping, America hits Iran, both sides pause, negotiators meet, repeat. Then in June, something changed, or appeared to. On June 14th came the announcement. On June 17th came the signature at Versailles. And on the same day, a senior American official read the full text to reporters, which is worth noting precisely because of how the debate was framed at the time. There was an entire news cycle built on the premise that the deal was being hidden. Prominent voices spent that week demanding the president release it, arguing that you cannot scrutinize an agreement nobody has seen, speculating that the reason it hadn't been published was that the contents were indefensible. That framing was wrong on the facts. The text was released. Reporters had drafts before that. The document was public within days of the signature, all 14 points of it. And that is what makes the following 40 days so much worse. Because the deal did not fail in the dark. It did not fail because of hidden side agreements or secret annexes or back-channel concessions that nobody could inspect. It failed in broad daylight, in the plain text of a document that anyone could read, and the sentence that killed it was sitting there in paragraph after paragraph for anyone willing to read like a lawyer instead of a partisan. Let's go through what was actually in it. Point 1 committed both parties to the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, explicitly including Lebanon, and bound them not to initiate any war or military operation against each other and to refrain from the threat or use of force. It also affirmed the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon. Point 2 committed both parties to respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and to refrain from interfering in each other's internal affairs. Point 3 committed both parties to negotiating and achieving a final deal within a maximum of 60 days, extendable by mutual consent. Read those three together and notice what they have in common. Every one of them is a commitment to a future commitment. Point 1 is a ceasefire, which is a pause, not a settlement. Point 2 is a diplomatic pleasantry that Iran has signed versions of before. Point 3 is the tell. The actual agreement, the one with the enforceable terms, does not exist yet. It is scheduled. The document everyone was celebrating was a promise to write a document. Point 4 required the United States to begin removing its naval blockade immediately upon signing. Not upon Iranian compliance, not upon verification. Upon signing. The single most effective instrument of pressure the United States had built over 3 months of war came off the board at the moment of signature, in exchange for a 60-day negotiating window. Then the sanctions terms. The United States undertook to terminate all types of sanctions and to make fully available the frozen or restricted funds and assets. A senior official told reporters that relief would be tied to the nuclear settlement and would apply to the extent Iran fulfilled its obligations, which is an important qualification, but the qualification lived in a briefing. The commitment lived in the text. On the nuclear question, Iran reaffirmed that it shall not procure or develop nuclear weapons. The disposition of the stockpiled enriched material would be resolved through a mechanism to be mutually agreed upon, with the minimum methodology specified as downblending on site under IAEA supervision. The two parties also agreed to discuss the issue of enrichment and other matters relating to Iran's nuclear needs, based on a satisfactory framework being agreed upon in the final deal. Every load-bearing word in that paragraph is deferred, mutually agreed upon, minimum methodology, to be discussed, based on a framework to be agreed. A senior American official called Iran's commitment to destroying its enriched stockpile a major, major win. But the text does not say destroy. The text says downblend on site as a floor, subject to a mechanism nobody had agreed to yet. This is precisely the objection the retired four-star raised on television in June, and he raised it as a technical point rather than a political one, which is why it deserved more attention than it got. His argument was that roughly 1,400 kilograms of 20 and 60% enriched uranium was buried at 3 sites, inaccessible, alongside destroyed enrichment infrastructure. Downblending leaves the material in the country. Leaving the cascades and the centrifuges in place, even damaged, leaves the pathway. His position was that the material has to be removed from Iranian territory entirely, and that there was real disagreement inside the technical community about whether downblending was ever the right answer. He was not arguing that Iran would definitely cheat. He was arguing that the agreement was built so that cheating would not be necessary. And then there is point 6. The United States, with regional partners, undertook to develop a definitive, mutually agreed plan with at least $300 billion for the reconstruction and economic development of the Islamic Republic of Iran. $300 billion. The objection raised at the time was not about whose money it was. Gulf money, American money. It made no difference to the argument. The objection was structural, and it was framed through a historical comparison that lands harder now than it did then. When the United States rebuilt Germany and Japan, the regimes that started those wars were no longer in power. Reconstruction money went to successor governments. Here, the government receiving the reconstruction plan is the same government that closed Hormuz, that fired on Gulf states, that armed the proxies, and that is now returned to doing all three. But none of those clauses is the one that killed the deal. The clause that killed the deal is about the water. The text required Iran to use its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels, with no charge, for 60 days only. Read that again, with no charge, for 60 days only. Read it a third time if you need to, because this is the entire story compressed into 11 words, and almost nobody flagged it in June. 2 phrases in that clause do all the damage. The first is best efforts. That is not a compliance standard, that is a standard of intention. A party can attack shipping through proxies, look the other way while a Revolutionary Guard naval unit acts on local initiative, and still argue with a straight face that it used its best efforts. There is no metric. There is no threshold. There is no violation trigger. because best efforts is a phrase that exists in contract law specifically to give a party room to underperform without breaching. The second phrase is worse, for 60 days only, because if free passage expires after 60 days, the text has conceded, in writing, with an American presidential signature under it, that a charge exists after 60 days, and if a charge exists, someone must have the authority to levy it. And if Iran has the authority to levy a transit charge in the Strait of Hormuz, then Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. The final text specified that free transit applied for 60 days only, and reporting has confirmed that this provision was not present in the earlier draft. It was added, and the agreement did not rule out the possibility that Iran could impose service fees down the road. Iran read that language exactly the way any competent lawyer would read it. Tehran took the clause to mean it could exert and maintain some degree of control over the strait. That is not a misreading. That is the plain meaning of the sentence. Iran did not need to violate the agreement to claim authority over Hormuz. The agreement handed it over conditionally and set a timer. The United States understood the exposure immediately. Central Command issued what it labeled a fact check on July 9th, restating the American position that Hormuz is an international waterway and Tehran has no right to control it. Think about what that means. 3 weeks after signing a document, the American military was publicly correcting the interpretation of the document. You do not issue a fact check about your own treaty unless the other side has found something in it you wish you had not written. Everything after that was mechanical. Just over a week after the signing, Iran launched a drone strike against a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. The United States read it as a ceasefire violation and responded with contained strikes. 3 more ships were attacked on July 6th and 7th. On July 7th, with strikes escalating, the president said publicly that he considered the truce to be over. On July 8th, at the NATO summit, he said it in language nobody could misinterpret. There's something wrong with them. They're cuckoo. As far as I'm concerned, it's over. He said the United States wasted a lot of time with them and should just do its business. Central Command announced fresh strikes the same day, framing them as degrading Iran's ability to target commercial and civilian shipping. The British Prime Minister, standing at the same summit, reminded both sides what a return to full war would cost and urged them to respect the ceasefire. Nobody respected the ceasefire. By July 9th, American aircraft had hit 90 targets in a single round, according to Central Command, and had widened the geographic scope of the campaign to include the southern and northeastern reaches of the country. Iran's foreign ministry said 2 bridges were struck. Explosions were reported in Bushehr. A projectile struck near the Bushehr nuclear power plant, hitting the area around a fishing pier at Banud, with boats burning on the water and footage that circulated the same day. The Iranian army said it had struck a Patriot interceptor battery in Kuwait, an early warning system in Qatar, and fuel tanks in Bahrain using a large number of kamikaze drones. That same week, Ali Khamenei was finally buried after marathon ceremonies stretching across days, and Israeli intelligence passed a warning to Washington that Tehran had devised a new plan to assassinate the President of the United States. By July 13th, the United States had run a 3rd consecutive night of strikes, with explosions reported in Bandar Abbas and across the islands of Kish, Keshem, and Abu Musa. Central Command announced the naval blockade would resume at 4 in the afternoon Eastern Time. Global oil prices surged more than 9% on the news in a single session. Iran claimed it had struck and disabled 2 rogue supertankers. The United Arab Emirates said Iranian missiles had hit 2 of its tankers in Omani territorial waters, killing 1 crew member. Saudi Arabia and the Houthis exchanged fresh strikes, ending a de facto truce that had held for months. And on that same day, the president offered his own post-mortem on the agreement he had signed 26 days earlier. He said it was a standard tactic to go to a memorandum of understanding, and then to a deal, that he had wanted to skip straight to the deal, and then he said this. It was sort of a test, and they weren't there. They didn't honor the test. A test, not an agreement, a test. If you have been following this story and you want more of this kind of breakdown as it develops, take a second to subscribe, because the next phase of this is going to move faster than the last one did. Here is where the war stands as of this morning, in hard numbers, because the numbers tell the story better than any statement from either capital. 13 consecutive nights of American strikes on Iran as of Friday, with the campaign now approaching the 2-week mark since it resumed in earnest. 90 targets in a single documented round on July 9th. A naval blockade fully reimposed. At least 2 separate incidents in the last week of American forces firing on merchant vessels attempting to breach that blockade, including 1 disabled tanker and another engaged on Friday evening. Brent crude above $100 a barrel as of July 23rd, the first time it has crossed that line since May, with a 9% single-day surge on the blockade announcement 10 days earlier, and the market pricing further supply constriction. Wall Street down on the same session. Kuwait struck, including a desalination plant and a fire at the Al Abdali border crossing that authorities said they contained. Bahrain under Iranian fire again. Qatar's early warning infrastructure targeted an American strike on a nuclear site on July 19th, both sides now openly threatening each other's civilian infrastructure, which is the threshold nobody wants crossed because there is no clean way back across it. The Houthis have announced a blockade of Saudi Arabia and threatened to close Bab al-Mandeb, which is the other end of the same maritime pressure point. 2 Saudi oil tankers attacked, Saudi Arabia striking Yemen in return. The Secretary of State publicly telling the Houthis they got suckered into attacking shipping lanes and calling on them to de-escalate. The president warning that the United States will hold Iran responsible for any future Houthi attack and threatening major military punishment. And the protests against this war are no longer confined to the Middle East. Demonstrations that began in February have continued worldwide, with the heaviest casualties in Pakistan, where between 26 and 35 people have been killed and more than 120 injured. 4 killed in Kenya, 1 in Comoros, injuries among police in the Philippines. This war is generating political instability in countries that have no direct stake in the Strait of Hormuz. Now let's talk about the 3 pressures operating simultaneously, because the reason the situation is more dangerous than the February phase is that all 3 are converging at once, and each one amplifies the other 2. The first is financial. The blockade is not primarily a military instrument. It is an economic one. It severs Iranian oil exports, which are the revenue base for the state, the military, and the proxy network simultaneously. Combined with the reimposition of sanctions and the freezing of assets that the memorandum was supposed to release, the Iranian economy is being compressed at exactly the moment when reconstruction from 5 months of bombing would require enormous capital inflow. The $300 billion that the memorandum promised is now hypothetical. Iran gave up the blockade relief it had won and got nothing durable in exchange. The second is military. 13 straight nights of strikes against a country whose air defense network was systematically dismantled beginning in February. Iran is not intercepting these strikes in any meaningful way. It is absorbing them and answering asymmetrically. Drones at Gulf states, missiles at tankers, proxies at shipping lanes, because that is the only response architecture it has left. Each asymmetric response invites a heavier American round. The exchange ratio is catastrophically against Tehran and gets worse every night. The third is psychological, and it is the one that receives the least analysis and matters the most. Iran's leadership has been physically hunted for 5 months. The supreme leader was killed in his own compound. His successor was wounded in that strike and buried his mother, his sister, and his wife from it. The IRGC commander was killed. The IRGC intelligence chief was killed in April. Senior officials have been assassinated at a rate that makes ordinary institutional function nearly impossible. And Israeli intelligence now assesses that Tehran is planning to kill the American president, which tells you the decision-making in Tehran has moved past strategic calculation and into something closer to blood logic. Financial strangulation, military dominance, and psychological siege, all at maximum simultaneously. That combination does not produce a negotiated settlement. It produces a cornered actor with nothing left to protect and no reason to preserve optionality. Which brings us to the question almost nobody in the mainstream coverage is asking: who is actually running Iran right now? The name on the memorandum is Masoud Pezeshkian, the president. He held the signed document up for photographs. He posted it to social media with the language about peace in the shadow of mutual respect. The digital signatures on the American-obtained text include the Vice President of the United States and Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament. None of those people have the authority to bind Iran on any of the questions the memorandum deferred. The supreme leader of Iran is Mojtaba Khamenei, 56 years old, in office since March 8th. Before he inherited the position, he spent 18 years as his father's vakil, his deputy, his proxy, the mechanism through which the office of the leader reached into institutions without leaving fingerprints. He has been known for years by nicknames that tell you everything about how he operated: the Phantom of Tehran, the Shadow Prince. He's a product of the comm seminary with essentially no Western exposure. His power base is not clerical legitimacy. It is patronage. He built de facto control over the Basij, over the IRGC intelligence organization, and over the Intelligence Protection Organization, the 3 institutions that watch everyone else in the Iranian system, including the military. Reporting from Iran International indicates the assembly of experts elected him under pressure from the IRGC, likely through the same patronage networks he spent 2 decades cultivating. That is a critical detail. He did not inherit the office through clerical consensus. He was installed by the security services, which means he owes them, which means his room to make concessions to Washington is structurally narrower than his father's ever was. And here's the part that should genuinely worry you. As of the second week of July, more than 4 months into his leadership, he had not appeared publicly since taking the position. Now, stack the vacancies against that. The IRGC intelligence organization has had no director since April 6th, when Majid Kademi was killed in an airstrike. The Intelligence Protection Organization, which he also ran, has been vacant since the same day. Ali Larijani, one of the most experienced strategic operators in the system, and a man who spoke directly to Washington's positions in public, is dead. Mohammad Pakpour, the IRGC commander, was killed on the first night of the war and replaced by Ahmad Vahidi. Amir Hatami commands the regular army. Majid Mousavi runs the IRGC Aerospace Force, having taken that job after his own predecessor was assassinated in 2025. Mohammad Karami runs the IRGC Ground Forces. Look at that list and notice the pattern. Nearly every operational commander in Iran is in a position they inherited from someone who was killed. The intelligence apparatus that would normally coordinate between them has no leadership at all. The supreme leader who sits above them is a man the security services installed, who is grieving 4 immediate family members, and who has not shown his face in public since taking office. That is not a chain of command. That is a set of parallel commands operating on inherited standing orders and institutional instinct. So here is the honest strategic assessment, and it is not the story either government is telling you. The general on television in June was right about the outcome and slightly wrong about the mechanism. His argument was behavioral. This regime lies. This regime cheats. There's not a scintilla of evidence of fundamental change. They will tell you a story about willingness to deal and then do something completely different. He was right that the deal would fail. But the failure was not primarily an act of bad faith by Tehran. The failure was drafted into the document. An agreement that defers every enforceable term to a future negotiation, that lifts the blockade on signature rather than on compliance, that sets a standard of best efforts rather than a standard of performance, and that concedes in writing that free transit expires after 60 days is not an agreement that Iran had to violate. It is an agreement Iran could comply with while doing exactly what it wanted. Tehran attacked shipping and claimed it was pursuing its rights under a clause the Americans had signed. Washington issued fact checks about its own treaty. Both readings of the text are defensible, which is precisely the problem. A document that permits 2 contradictory readings of the central question is not a settlement. It is a scheduled argument. The American position now is bifurcated, and the president has said so directly. Asked Friday what his exit strategy is, he said there are a lot of them. There's a military exit where the United States keeps going the way it is and can make it a heavier dose, knocking out everything. Or there is what he called the smarter strategy, which is to make a deal. And he said they want to make a deal, but he doesn't think they're ready yet. He said negotiations with Tehran are ongoing. He said the United States could do it in a more rapid fashion, which they might do, or negotiate, which they are also doing right now. He met with senior advisors and cabinet officials the same day to discuss escalation if the negotiations fail. He has also said Iran is not ready and that its leaders have some evil intentions. And then on Friday, he said the massive attack he had threatened may not be necessary, and that he believes Tehran is getting more serious. Republican hawks are urging him to go big. The Israeli prime minister is arriving in Washington. Iraq's prime minister traveled to Tehran on Thursday, having met the president at the White House the week before, and Iran's foreign minister indicated he might be carrying messages. Everything is in motion at once, in both directions, and that is the least stable configuration possible. The vice president described it on a podcast in mid-July with unusual candor, saying the trajectory is right, but it is going to be really messy, with a lot of starts and stops. That is an honest description. It is also a description of a policy that has no defined terminal condition. Starts and stops are what you get when the objective has not been settled, when one part of the government is trying to compel a nuclear settlement, another is trying to keep a waterway open, another is trying to avoid a ground war, and the president is genuinely undecided between a heavier dose and a handshake. And here's the one thing that keeps us serious analysts awake, the variable that matters more than any headline about oil prices or strike counts. Nobody can currently guarantee Iranian compliance with anything, including the Iranians. That is the structural risk. Not bad faith, not deception, incapacity. When the supreme leader is invisible, when the intelligence directorate that coordinates the security state has been vacant for nearly 4 months, when every service commander is a replacement for someone assassinated, and when the proxy network is taking actions that the Secretary of State publicly describes as the Houthis getting suckered into a fight, then even a Tehran that sincerely wanted a settlement could not enforce one on its own forces. Think about what that does to negotiation. Every future agreement has the same flaw as the last one, and it is not fixable by better drafting. You can write an ironclad verification regime, and it will still fail because the signature will come from a president who does not command the guard, ratified by a leader who does not appear in public, transmitted to commanders who inherited their posts from dead men, and executed by proxies in Yemen and Lebanon who have their own war aims and their own casualties to answer for. Then add the assassination plot. A state that is planning to kill the American president is not a state preserving a diplomatic channel. Either that plan reflects the actual will of the leadership, in which case negotiations are theater, or it reflects a faction operating outside leadership control, in which case there is no leadership to negotiate with. There is no third reading that is reassuring. And add the last variable, the one that will decide the next 72 hours. Both sides have now started threatening civilian infrastructure. A desalination plant in Kuwait has already been hit, bridges have already been struck, a projectile has already landed near a functioning nuclear power plant at Bushehr. Every one of those is a step onto a rung of the ladder that historically does not have a rung below it once you have climbed. The thing that turns a bombing campaign into a regional catastrophe is almost never a decision. It is an accident with no one available to absorb it. 42 days ago, there were signatures at Versailles and a photograph of an Iranian president holding a document over his head, and a post from the American president telling the ships of the world to start their engines and let the oil flow. The ships did start their engines. Some of them are now on the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz. One of them took a missile in Omani waters and a crew member died on it. Others are being fired on by the United States Navy for trying to run a blockade that the same document promised would be lifted forever. The oil did not flow. It is above $100 a barrel and climbing, and the second choke point at Bab al-Mandeb is now under threat too. The general said it plainly in June before any of this happened. He said the president should just release the text and let people see what's out there so we stop debating about something none of us has seen. The text was released, all 14 points of it, everyone saw it. That turned out to be the problem. Because the sentence that ended this deal was never hidden in a back channel or a secret annex. It was sitting in plain language in a public document that both governments signed and neither government could agree on the meaning of, and the 60-day clock it started ran out somewhere over the Strait of Hormuz while the ships were still burning. The 60 days are nearly gone now. There is no final deal. There is a blockade, a bombing campaign in its third week, a supreme leader nobody has seen, an intelligence service with no director, and a president in Washington choosing between a heavier dose and one more attempt at the table. Whatever gets signed next, if anything gets signed next, will be signed by the same people, under the same conditions, with the same gap between the name on the page and the hand on the trigger. Ask yourself who, exactly, would be bound by it.